want to talk to you today about a dangerous philosophy that has been occurring for over the past 2 centuries. We see that the doctrine of mythicism has arisen. And you might be asking yourself, what is mythicism? Basically, it's those who believe that Jesus never really existed as a historical person. And of course, we want to ask ourselves the question, did Jesus really exist? When we think about what's happening in America, in 21st century America, we see that there are so many fundamentals of the faith that are being attacked from every side. And maybe it's that these mythicists actually do us a service when they try to attack the historical person of Jesus Christ, because we can look into the evidence and see that there is indeed such a man that was named Jesus of Nazareth. And of course, we see that we can have a firm foundation to stand upon. And so we want to answer that question. Did Jesus really exist? You know, I want to mention some of the mythicists, such as Dan Barker, who writes in an article called Debunking the Historical Jesus, he said, "There is serious doubt that Jesus ever existed. It is impossible to prove he was a historical figure. It is much more plausible to consider the Jesus character to be the result of myth-making, a human process that is indeed historically documented." This was a man who turned from being religious to becoming an atheist, and he believed that Jesus was a myth. And so we're here to answer that question. We're not here to necessarily answer if Jesus was the Son of God or if he was the Messiah. Those are for another lesson. But did he really live in space-time history? Did he live on this planet? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 main points. I just want to go through an overview of the history of mythicism with you, show you how it arose, and then I want you to see the historical documents that record Jesus, showing that he is a historical person. And then, since we know that the evidence will support that Jesus did exist, the question we must ask ourselves is, what will we do with him? So let me just go with you a little bit through the history of mythicism. When you look at the history of mythicism, like I said, it started over about 2 centuries ago, roughly. And we see that there was a man who was recorded as basically the one who started off saying that Jesus was a myth, and his name was Constantine Bonnet. And he wrote a piece of literature in 1791 called The Ruins of Empire. And basically what he was trying to do was, his main thesis was he was trying to look at all the religions in the world and say that they went back to basically one universal religion, that Christianity was really just one variation of that. Then there was a man by the name of Charles Dupuis, and basically he wrote a book called The Origin of All Religions, 1795. It was over 2,000 pages long. And basically he tried to do the same thing as Bonnet. Basically what he was trying to do is find the original deity. He wanted to unmask who is the original deity behind all these deities that have ever arisen. That's what his basis, his thesis of his book was all about. Then we move a little bit more into a man by the name of Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer was a German theologian. He actually did believe in the historical Jesus, but then sadly he went to the other side and started believing that actually the gospel writers made him up as a literary invention. And he wrote a couple books. He wrote a book such as The Criticism of the Gospel of John in 1840, Criticism of the Gospels, 1850 to 1852, and The Origin of Christianity from the Greco-Roman Civilization in 1877. So he spent over 40 years trying to discount basically Jesus in being a myth. Then we go on to another man by the name of J.M. Robertson. He was a British rationalist, and he wrote a book called Christianity and Mythology in 1900. And basically what he tried to do was, he tried to say that, you know, all these gods who in a sense who died and then rose again, who basically brought fertility back to the land, they were somehow linked to Jesus, that Christianity is a copy of these pagan religions. And that was J.M. Robertson's thesis of his book. And then we move to Arthur Drew's, who wrote The Christ Myth in 1909. And sadly, Arthur Drew's book was read by a man named Lenin. And as you remember, Lenin was known for, sadly, leading the people of the Soviet Union into more atheistic beliefs because he was influenced by that book. Then there was G.A. Wells, probably the most famous modern mythicist in our time. He was a man who wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist in 1975. And basically his book stands as one of the more prominent books. But then what we have today is in the year 2000s, we've actually had a couple of guys who have risen on the scene, and they say that Jesus did not really exist. And their names are Earl Daughtry, Richard Carrier, and Robert Price. And you can see the books that they wrote, and basically we see that mythicism is not dead. And so why is it the case that, why do they strongly believe that Jesus never really existed? Well, I can't answer that question for you. Only they can really answer that question. But we can answer the question, are we willing to be honest or dishonest with the evidence? Because the evidence is very clear on what the historical sources will give to us. So let me just now direct your attention to the historical documents that bear the record of Jesus Christ. You know, the mythicists, they make the argument that there are no first century documents that basically will say that Jesus really exists in the first century outside of, course, the Gospels and Paul's writings outside of the Bible. And then, of course, they make the argument that the historical Jesus did not appear prominently in the early Christian writings, of course, except for the Gospels. Now, I just want you to think about something with me, if that's all right. Think about ancient history for a moment. And who do we usually find in ancient history? Well, we'll find, famous politicians, we find kings, we find rulers, we find people who are famous for their inventions. Just think about people who really made an impact in this world. And then we think about, and if you don't mind, just think about Jesus for a moment. And if you don't mind, try to, even though we know that He is the Son of God, we know He's the Messiah, just think about Him in the ordinary sense as we would look through ancient history. Think about Him as a Galilean who was from Nazareth, who grew up in that very despicable town. And yeah, he had a following. Yes, he had some followers. And yes, there's crowds that followed him from time to time. But he lived in that Judean province of under Rome. I mean, that place wasn't very spectacular in ancient history times. So just think about how it is the case that we would actually have historical sources about Jesus. That's what's really amazing to us, that this so-called peasant, the so-called a person who was so-called a prophet, actually became very famous. So I just want you to think about that as we go through the historical evidence. Because when historians try to figure out, okay, who do we know is really real in history? How can we separate fact from fiction? And the way that some methods of historians do this is they'll look at, for example, photographs. For example, I mean, we could look in the Civil War times, and there was actually photographs taken of our president, 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. You can see him at Antietam. There's actually a photograph of that. And there's actually a photograph of the Holocaust that took place. You know, there's some people that don't even believe the Holocaust really occurred, but yet there's all these dead bodies of people whom the Nazis killed. And it shows us evidence that that event really did exist. Then, of course, there's surviving products that link back to that historical person. For example, I got to go to the Mount Vernon where George Washington actually lived. And also Thomas Jefferson, who lived in his Monticello. So you can see how these were true historical figures. And then, of course, we can actually know by their literary writings. For example, Anna Frank. Remember the little Jewish girl who wrote a diary during World War II. And we see that she was indeed a real person for writing this diary. And so as we go through the evidence, I want you to see that there are actually first century documents outside of the Gospels and outside of the New Testament that give examples of Jesus as a true historical person. What I want to deal with right now is Josephus. Josephus was a man who was a Jew. He basically was a general in his army, the Jewish army, who was attacking the Romans during the Roman-Jewish War that went from 66 to 70 A.D. Well, what happened was Josephus and his men were trapped, and each of them committed suicide except for Josephus. And Josephus was captured by the Romans, and actually the Romans let him live, and he was able to actually write some books that have stood the test of time, some known as the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars. And so we see that Josephus wrote around 75 to about 90 A.D. And what's really interesting is I actually went through and I found that he mentions the name Jesus over 54 times. Now what's interesting is that not every single one of those times are mentioning Jesus of Nazareth, but there are 2 times out of those 54 times that we are very interested in. Let me give you the first one, Antiquities of the Jews 20.9.1. where it says, "When therefore Annas was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So notice there's a time between Festus, which we know who we see him in the book of Acts. He died, and then there's about a new procurator that's going to come on named Albinus. Well, during this time, we see Annas seize his power to kill James, and it says, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. Now that's very interesting. We're seeing this connection to a more famous person, because there were many James that lived in the first century. There were many who went by that name. But to say that there is a certain James who had a brother named Jesus called the Messiah, that shows you that this Jesus must have existed. So anyways, we need to go back even 2 chapters further of what Josephus says. What's really interesting is that Josephus talks about Pilate. Remember, the one who executed Jesus. And we see that he's treated as a historical person. And what's really interesting is he records some of the acts of Pilate. He records, for example, that Pilate had brought images from Caesarea, and then the Jews were just would rather die than rather have these images in Jerusalem, because that would be breaking one of the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. So they said, would you put these away? We plead with you, Pilate, to put these away, and Pilate did so. And then the next thing that Pilate did was he actually used some of the treasury money to build this water aqueduct, and the Jews were furious about that. Well, what's really interesting is what Josephus writes next after these acts. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets have foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful works concerning him, and the tribes of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." Now, when we read that, of course, we see that there's a case where people would make the argument that Josephus was not a Christian. So why would it be the case that he's writing something like this? And let's, for just a moment, assume that there were interpolations, that somehow maybe a Christian scribe did get in here and did insert these into that. If you don't mind, let's just read it again and leave out those, what we would probably call interpolations. And we'll see what it says again. "Now there was about this time Jesus, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to death, to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him." Now I want you to think about that for a moment. because there's still the historical existence of Jesus if we removed all those. And so we see that the historical evidence still stands. Now I want to bring your attention to another writer who was a Roman historian named Tacitus. He lived he wrote his books around 115 AD, and he wrote about the emperors. And in this case, he was writing about the annuals of Nero. And Nero was a despicable guy, as we well know. His morals were very, very shady. Let me just put it that way. And basically, there was a fire that was caused in Rome, and many people assume that Nero was the one that caused it. And of course, it says that Nero blamed the Christians. And let me read to you what Tacitus writes. He says, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." Notice that Tacitus writes for us about how he confirms that there was a man named Christus. Of course, that's he didn't actually spell it correctly, but we can pretty much figure it out that he is talking about Jesus Christ. Now, it's really interesting that Tacitus, if he really wanted to say that this was some kind of rumor and that this was some kind of hearsay, he actually, throughout his book, 70 times, actually distinguishes between that which is fact and that which is hearsay. And if he really felt that this account of Jesus was hearsay, he probably would have said so. Well, let me now bring your attention to Pliny the Younger. And Pliny the Younger was a governor of Bithynia, and he was writing to the Emperor Trajan, and he says, "They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day," talking about Christians, "before dawn, and sing responsively a hymn to Christ, to a God, and bound themselves to a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, not to deny trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. When this was over, it was their custom to part and assemble again to partake of a meal, but ordinary and innocent food." So we see that even Pliny the Younger even believes that there was the existence of this leader called Christ, that the Christians believed him to be a God. Well, then there's Suetonius, another historian, and he writes this. In Claudius 25.4, he wrote the lives of the 12 Caesars, and he writes about Claudius, one of the 12 Caesars. He says, "Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbance at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled them from the city." And obviously this is a reference to Acts 18 verse 2, where the Jews were expelled from Rome. And so I want you to see that he seems to imply Christus as a title. And furthermore, we see that throughout history, there were people who actually got the name Christian wrong. They spelled it wrong, such as Tertullian. He actually writes, "Most people so blindly knock their heads against the hatred of the Christian name is wrongly pronounced by you as Christians, for you do not even know accurately the name you hate. But the special ground of dislike to the sect is that it bears the name of its founder." Even Justin Martyr, who's known for being a Christian apologist, was one who actually misspelled the name of Christ. So we go along to Celsus. He was an early enemy of the church. He wrote around 200 AD, so to speak. And basically what he wrote about was, or I'll just use one example where he says, "Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. It was by means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures of the resurrection or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than a trick of jugglers." So you can see what he's basically saying about the special powers, the miracles that Christ performed, but he never did deny the existence of Jesus. In fact, he writes against the virgin birth of Christ. He writes against the disciples of Christ. But he never does deny the existence of Jesus. Then there was Lucian. Lucian writes, he was a satirist, and he wrote, "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished person who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws." And then, of course, there's Baron Bar Serapon, who wrote about Jesus. And listen very carefully. He was a Gentile who wrote to his son while he was in prison. He writes, "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." Talking about AD 70. "God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samoans were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, lived in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." And so there's no doubt that those details are describing Jesus Christ. And then there's the Babylonian Jewish Talmud. Talmud was a series of oral traditions that the Jews wrote down. It's really interesting what one of them records. It says, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. 40 days before the execution, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he had practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward was in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover." So as you can see, there were many who wrote about Jesus. In fact, there was another man, and I'll just put this on the screen. We won't read through all of it, but basically Julius Africanus, who was a historian in the 3rd century AD, he records the historians Thallus and Pelagian, and basically what they record is they tried to, the darkness that occurred and during those 3 hours that Jesus was on the cross. Well, we see Thallus, he tries to say that was a natural event, that it was a solar eclipse. And so we see that Julius Africanus writes against this and says, well, during the Passover, it's a full moon. How could there be an eclipse? And that's what he wrote. And so as you can see, we have all this historical evidence. We have over 9 documents that support that Jesus did exist. Now when we think about it, why is it the case that many, in spite of the evidence, not want Jesus to exist? Well, it's because if he does exist, then what are we going to do with him? I haven't even introduced our New Testament documents yet, and Paul's writings. We haven't even said anything from their eyewitness testimony that there was these men who followed Jesus who went to their deaths to follow him. Would they die knowing that they were supporting a lie? That they actually knew it was a lie? Who would die for a lie? And so we see that, what do they tell us about Christ? Well, for example, Matthew writes that the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, we see that God, when he made promises to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and 2 Samuel chapter 7, there was one to be born in that line, in that genealogy, who would come, who would reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In Mark chapter 1, verse 1, Mark records the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Indeed, we see Jesus declared the Son of God when he was resurrected from the dead, as Romans 1, 1 through 4 states. We see Luke, a great historian, writes in Luke 1, 1 through 4, he says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." As you look throughout Luke, you see that he is one of the most credible historians of all time, that what he wrote was indeed true, and that we can know that Jesus indeed is the Son of God. 1 John 1, 1-4, one of Jesus' closest disciples, he writes, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. That which we have seen and heard we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we write to you, that your joy may be full." You see, John was writing about how Jesus had appeared to them, and He showed His hands, He was able to show His feet, He's able to show His side, and we see that our Lord showed evidence that He really did die on the cross and that He arose from the dead. In fact, Paul, that's why he converted to the faith. That's why he turned from being an enemy of Christianity to the truth. Paul had of course, we think about his life. Why would he turn to something like this? He wasn't going to gain power or money or lust from going into this new religion. The only real true reason why he would go into Christianity was because he knew it to be the truth, that the Old Testament did indeed point to Christ as the true Messiah. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4 talks about, "Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which you stand, but which also you are saved, if you hold fast to which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered you first of all, that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that He was buried, and that He rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." You see, Jesus, He rose from the dead, and 1 Peter 1:3 says that Jesus indeed brought this living hope. Peter talks about that living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even James and Jude, the half-brothers of Jesus, testify that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. And so as we look through this evidence, you can know that Jesus did indeed truly exist. What are you going to do with Him?